Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In 2022, Counterweight, the organization that Helen Pluckrose founded and that was absorbed into the Institute for Liberal Values, had a virtual conference on alternatives to diversity and inclusion. Starting in 2025, we will be rolling out one talk a month that was presented at the conference. We sit down with the original presenters throughout 2025 to see what has changed since 2022. With diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives seemingly on the chopping block, we are curious to hear what our original participants are witnessing and experiencing on the ground. Is DEI really dead or just in remission? Are there healthy alternatives to DEI that we should consider, or do we throw the baby out with the bathwater and wipe our hands clean? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. This month, Jennifer Richmond interviews Brandy Shufutinsky. In the update to her original talk on liberal approaches to diversity and inclusion, where she highlighted anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism and the ties between the two, we explore what has changed since 2022, especially in light of the October 7, 2023 massacre of Israeli citizens and the current conversations around Israel and Palestine. The global intifada is a strange marriage of Islamist and left-wing extremism, often called the Red-Green Coalition. While it is often easy to spot extreme right-wing anti-Semitism, the red-green version of anti-Semitism is often unacknowledged. This does not result in a proliferation of diversity and inclusion, but rather an erasure of history and the erosion of common values. Welcome, Brandy, to our Dissidents Podcast. We have invited you because what we're doing is we found the motherlode of counterweight presentations that we did back in October of 2022 for the Counterweight Conference on Diversity and Inclusion. We thought we'd lost them. So once a month, we are releasing the actual presentation, but we're also releasing with an update because 2022 was actually a really long time ago. And so much has changed. Our thrust behind the 2022 conference was, how do we do diversity and inclusion? We called it diversity and inclusion. We took the equity out. Wasn't even going to have that conversation. But how can we do diversity and inclusion in a good way? In your talk at the time, and by the way, for our audience now, there will be a link to your original talk. So your talk at the time, you really focused on anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. And I really want to take this conversation and focus on the anti-Semitism part, because I have a lot of questions for you on what has changed since that time, since 2022. We know a lot has changed in 2020, October 20, a year later. We saw the massacre of people in Israel. But before we go there, let's start with the anti-Black racism. There's a lot that's changed in DEI. A lot of policy that's come out of the new administration, canceling a lot of DEI initiatives. A lot of people heralding that, as a good, other people not so sure. What is your thought on kind of the new policies around DEI? Has anything changed? Has it been for the good? Has it been for the worse? And where are we on that, kind of basic black-white, if you will, DEI?
Well, thanks for having me back to discuss this. I think it's timely and super important. I think that looking at what the administration is doing as far as rolling back DEI initiatives, the first thing that comes to mind is why. Now, people that are opposed to the rollback, you'll hear talk, well, it's racist, or it's an attack on Black students in schools, or it's an attack on communities of color, etc. I'm looking at it at a different level, not that surface level kind of, okay, sure, just anything that somebody doesn't like gets labeled racist. And I think one thing that it highlights is that a lot of the initiatives to roll back DEI programming are coming because the programs were not functioning in the way that some people believed they were originally intended. So, for example, they weren't necessarily making organizations function better.
Right.
The DEI programs weren't allowing for better communication, better working conditions across the board for all employees. Employees have reported needing to self-censor out of fear that they would be called to the DEI principal's office for reprimand. We aren't seeing improved outcomes for the communities that DEI programs were supposed to help. in, say, schools. We're not seeing reading levels, numeracy levels, learning actually improve. In fact, we've seen a decrease. So I'd start there. If the program isn't functioning how intended, then I think it is worth revisiting whether a program is worth maintaining, or whether we should think about maybe doing something else and rolling back what isn't working.
So again, I think the idea around diversity, I think we've had this conversation before, is a noble one. It was more the way that they were putting people into classes, right? Oppressor, oppressed. And we saw that, and this will bring us into our conversation around anti-Semitism. We saw that too, where Jews were often being put in, in these binary classes as the oppressors. And so they were marrying, if you will, the BLM movement with the BDS movement, which is the what is the B? The
Boycott, divestment,
boycott,
sanctions.
divestment, and sanction. I think in the original, I actually asked that too. I failed on that, and you kind of saw how that was being lumped together. Then the BLM movement, and it was kind of part of this. It's so complex. Part of this DEI thing also, or this DEI monster or machine, if you will, also brought in a lot of this ideas around settler colonialism. And so what I'm seeing, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm seeing like some of the language around DEI is being dismissed or being rolled back, if you will. But there's so many nuances to it that are not. For example, the settler colonial language has really remained, and it's really shown up mostly in the conversation around anti-Semitism. We've been seeing this globalize the Intifada movement. And I mean, I think we've seen anti-Semitism rise more since you and I had this conversation than we did. And you had pointed out at the time, again, this is in 2022. You had pointed out at the time so many incidents, and I wrote them down, where there were two American Jews who were survivors of I can't even speak this morning, survivors of sexual assault that were not allowed to be part of a sexual assault group because they were lumped in this oppressor class. So we were seeing this already in 2022. 2023 rolls around. I mean, what have you seen happening? Are we addressing it well? When we talk about rolling back DEI, is it, anti-Semitism it seems like as anti-racism might be going down, or at least the rollback of DEI programs is going down, if that's even the case, which that's debatable, but I don't want to spend too much time on that today. Anti-Semitism has been on the rise. I mean, last week, we can talk about October 7th, but last week, I mean, the horrible death of two young people.
Right. I think that when we look at programs like DEI, or any initiative that's based on the ideas of settler colonialism or the oppression binary, when we apply that to the Black communities and to the Jewish communities, we're seeing that those two communities represent opposite sides of the same illiberal coin. And so the rollback of maybe some of the DEI initiatives may address the stereotyping and prejudice and biases that lead to what I see as furthering anti-Black racism instead of being a correction for it. What we're also seeing is that DEI is just this name. A few years ago, it was CRT. What really isn't focused on is the ideology behind it, which I think is one of the reasons why we're still seeing that ideology fester and fuel growing anti-Jewish bigotry.
So tell me more about that ideology behind it. What are the roots that we kind of missed in this rollback of DEI, first of all, this broad, push for DEI, and now this broad rollback of DEI. I don't think we're addressing the problem in the first place. So tell me more about those ideological roots.
So part of that is that it's this idea that if you belong to a particular group, whether it's racial group, ethnic group, sex, that all of the stereotypes related to that group apply to all members of that group. So we're talking about Black Americans. The idea that, in my opinion, again, has fueled anti-Black prejudice and stereotypes in a lot of DEI programs has been that, well, Black students can't achieve without. So they're so special and so disenfranchised and so weak and so unable to achieve that Black Americans need all of these special programs. It's dehumanizing. So the same ideology actually that was used to keep Black Americans disenfranchised a century ago is now being used as part of an ideology from the group of the so-called helpers, which again, and what we're seeing is it's leading again to the same type of dehumanization, rather than looking at individuals and individual circumstances and understanding that, sure, race may inform one's experience, but it doesn't determine it. And that's a very different, the informing and determining an experience based on race or sex or um, sexual preference, that's a completely different framework and a completely different lens than saying, well, this determines it. So the ideology holds that because I'm Black and because I'm a woman, then that means that I can't achieve without all of these extra programs to help me because I'm just so downtrodden and weak and stupid and unable again to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of that coin is that leads to anti-Jewish bigotry is that because this group as a whole has achieved above the mean on average, that means they must have achieved due to exploiting others. Because this is also Jews in America are also a minority group. Jews in America have also gone through bigotry and racism and other forms of discrimination. But on average, because there's this stereotype that because somebody's Jewish, that must mean that they have to have then achieved all of these things, whether it's education or economic or social, whatever it is. And the stereotyping is the part that I think is really important and that maybe we're not paying enough attention to when we have these conversations. Those ideas, that ideology cannot exist without the stereotyping of individuals and groups. And that's what's harmful.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then let's take that even further. I mean, the guy who was responsible for the death of the two young people in D.C., he was not even. I mean, this talking about this global intifada. He was not Muslim. He had no real roots to Palestine, but he had roots to the National Socialist movement. Where do you see that kind of overlap or that what's the word I want to say? Intersection. Yes, yes, yes. Or yes, it's dissipating. This anti-Semitism seems to be dissipating, whereas before it was before October 7th, 2023, it seemed to be kind of more like silently part of the BLM BDS. It wasn't quite as obvious, I think, to your average American.
There's a lot. I think there's a lot there. One, I think, I believe October 7th was a call to arms. I think that it was a call for the globalization of the Intifada, which I believe is what we're seeing. And unfortunately, the two young Israeli embassy staffers in DC were murdered because of it. And the crossover between Islamist anti-Semitism and far leftist anti-Semitism has existed at least for, half a century, more. I mean, it's been in existence for a while. Those two groups of extremists have come together to hate Jews and to call for violence against Jews for a long time, longer than you and I have been alive. So it's not necessarily new. It's an echo of, history doesn't repeat, but it echoes. Well, we're living through that echo right now. And unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is a lack of will, perhaps from elected officials and leaders who typically are left of center on the political spectrum from acknowledging that fact and that truth. And that's not to dismiss that there are neo-Nazis and far-right extremists that want to kill and murder Jews too. They exist, they still exist, they're still there. But the type of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in the streets of DC, right now it appears in the streets of Toronto today, it's not coming from that group. And I just want to make one point here. When the Tiki torchers in Charlottesville marched with their chants of the Jews will not replace us, the same people, the same leaders who sit left of center on the political spectrum had no problem calling that out for what it was, Jew hatred. They seem to have a problem calling out the same extreme Jew hatred that's coming from their political or ideological camp, or at least from the political ideological camp that they think they're sitting in. So the chance of globalized intifada that started on October 7th and October 8th through our communities, on campuses, high schools, universities, colleges, they've been able to hide behind this shield of, free speech. Well, I mean, the Jews will not replace us could also have been labeled free speech. I didn't see those people calling it that, though. They weren't excusing it the way it's being excused right now.
What do you think? I mean, are there policies that give you hope right now of turning this over? I mean, I haven't seen anything that everything I see just keeps on, just keeps on festering. I'm failing to see anything, unlike the attempts. Again, we can discuss at another time whether they're good or bad, or if they end up, rolling back DEI in, positive ways. But I don't see that happening with regards to anti-Semitism. It seems to be not a part of this DEI rollback. What are we doing about this?
I mean, I see it slightly different. I think that the
Okay.
rollback of any type of program that relies on an ideology that is illiberal and that foments anti-Semitism is a good thing, and hopefully will lead to a decrease in anti-Semitism, or at least a decrease in those programs having the power to justify their Jew hatred. I don't think we're there yet. I think it's too soon to know, to see the results of that still. Those institutions that seem to be holding on to those programs, by the skin of their teeth, they're so desperate to hold on to them. They're not at a point yet where they don't have the power, again, to fuel anti-Semitism. I think we're getting there. I think that it's going to take a couple more months and a whole lot more work and will of the people to demand better of those institutions, or at least demand that those institutions aren't the ones that kind of set the table for the rest of us.
Right. And how would people like even recognize this? So, you see a lot of this also filtering in. You and I've been watching it through K through 12 education. And I don't know that parents even recognize, particularly parents who aren't of Jewish, origin or, ethnicity, they don't recognize some of the language that's coming through as anti-Semitic. And I think that's one of the biggest problems too, is because it can kind of slide past if you're not looking for it. If you're not of the Jewish
Mhm.
faith and there's not certain keywords or triggers that you're aware of. I mean, give us some like concrete examples of ways that you have seen it infiltrate in various school systems, and so that we can start to alert ourselves to what to be on the lookout for.
So I don't like to start with the anti-Semitism, because you're right, it's difficult for people who aren't part of the Jewish nation and part of the Jewish people to recognize. And I don't think that you have to start there. Um, Ethnic minorities, religious minorities thrive in societies that are based on liberal values, small l, liberal values that have a respect for minority rights, that have a respect for freedom, that have a respect for liberty. So if I were talking to a parent who has a kid in the K through 12 education system, I would say, well, you know what? Does your kid's school, do they have an American flag hanging? Do they have any flags hanging? Do they say the Pledge of Allegiance? What do they learn about the founding of our country, of the United States of America? And chances are, if they don't have an American flag, but maybe they have a whole bunch of other flags, or they don't say the Pledge of Allegiance because of whatever the excuse is, besides maybe there isn't enough time in the day, or if they're taught that, well, the United States is fundamentally and foundationally racist, then chances are what's being taught to those kids isn't just anti-American ideology, which likely is, but they will also be taught demonizing things about Jewish people.
Hmm. And that really, I mean, let's for people who are unaware, because again, this was kind of new to me, and it kind of slipped in under the DEI mantle, if you will, but the settler colonialism.
Right.
And that's something that we hear being brought out. I mean, it was there already, and you even mentioned it in the other conversation in 2022. But it was after 2023 that that really became almost a buzzword in America. So a lot of people, were hearing it for the first time. Give us some background and history on, how that's being used and how it's kind of playing into both anti-Semitism and into the DEI movement in general.
I think it started with a lot of talk about indigenous rights, land back movements, and then the idea of decolonization. So decolonization ideology is what settler colonialism is actually based on. And what's interesting is we can have a very serious academic debate about the founding of the United States as a country, and about manifest destiny, and about the indigenous peoples here who were sometimes disenfranchised from their land. Sometimes land was purchased. We can talk about all of that, and get into the real history. And I actually think that that's an important thing to do. But to call the United States a settler colony actually doesn't make sense because the United States wasn't an imperial power. If we talked about Britain when we weren't, before we were the United States, before we won the revolution, that's a different story. But the people that founded the United States of America were from here. So you can't be a settler colonial state when you're from that land, even if their ancestors weren't. So there's a little bit of a different, it's a different level of academic scholarship to have that conversation, which I don't think, honestly, in any K through 12 classroom, it's really going to get to that point in that level.
Right.
But how that gets applied is that this idea that all indigenous peoples are quote unquote people of color is also part of what's fueled this decolonization movement. So I'll give an example. I cannot remember the year. Pardon me. Seriously, after COVID, I've had trouble keeping up with what year it is. But there was this push to decolonize K through 12 curriculum in Scotland. The people that were pushing it weren't Scottish. And that movement was calling to kind of erase Scottish history in Scotland as a way to decolonize Scottish curriculum in K through 12. And that again goes back to the idea that, well, indigenous peoples aren't Scottish in Scotland, the country. I mean, it has it in its name, but that's how far it's gone. So I'm not surprised when we see it in a place like the United States where our history is complicated, or a place like Israel where the history honestly isn't that complicated. People always talk about the situation in Israel. Oh, it's complicated. Not really. It actually is quite simple and straightforward. People's ideologies and desires to maintain some form of justification for their Jew hatred complicates it. But the history of Israel is not complicated. It is long and it is rich, but it's not complicated.
Tell me a little bit more. I've heard a lot about initiatives in K through 12 education of decolonizing the classroom, decolonizing the curricula. What does that even mean? Again, so like for us who, I mean, they're just throwing out these buzzwords that are rather new, but obviously have a lot of meaning in a lot of different ways. What are we looking for? When they say decolonize the classroom, decolonize the curricula, what does that mean? What does that look like?
I mean, I usually hear that statement followed up by, we've learned a very Eurocentric American history, or we learn about or read too many dead white men. We need to not read as many. We need to not even not read as many. This is part of the problem, is there seems to be a desire by the folks that are calling to decolonize the curriculum to erase anything related to European history and as it relates to America and white American history. That's not inclusive. It's not diverse. Like it or not, white people played a role in the founding of our country. I mean, we're America. Now, I completely agree when we look at the face of the United States today in 2025 versus the face of the United States in 1776. Obviously, it looks different. And there are more stories and people that have contributed to the founding of our country that kids should be learning about in class. 100% agree. That shouldn't come at the cost of erasing those that also contributed. I mean, it's just another form of erasure. And I don't think that the idea of, well, my group of people suffered under the boot of racism, so now it's our turn to be racist against others, shouldn't be a goal that our K through 12 classes or higher ed institutions should be, striving to achieve.
So if they were to say, for example, okay, we want to diversify curricula, so that we make sure that we touch on various groups that have, not been really identified in our classrooms and our curricula, that's a good thing. It's more the militant form of decolonization where it's erasure. It's not just saying, let's add more, let's be more inclusive, not bad things in and of themselves, but it's the erasure part that is really kind of taken the decolonization movement. Is that right?
Yeah. And the inability to see that some individuals, some historical figures were both great and terrible, that can exist within one individual. I can talk all the time about how horrible it is that the first president of our country was also a slaveholder. I can also discuss how great it was that he achieved, or he led our country to victory over the British Empire. Both of those things are true. The preferencing one over the other has, I think, led to this very black and white binary thinking that honestly is ignorant.
So When they talk about decolonization, though, in the context, we'll get to Israel in a second, but in the context of America, I mean, what is the goal? What would decolonization look like? I mean, I don't, it's
I mean, to me, what it looks like is chaos because I look at the
yeah,
places that have been supposedly decolonized. I mean, the students on the university campuses since October 7th have shown us what it looks like. They're
mm,
the ones that have said that they've decolonized this building or that library, and it really, or this quad space with their tents and porta potties and whatever else they're doing. It looks like chaos.
yeah. And so the call for decolonization in Israel and that tie that they make between, us being Israel and the United States being colonizing states. I mean, what is the goal for them? What's the decolonization movement look like for Israel?
Part of what makes this part is complicated is because the calls to decolonize Israel are calls to erase Jewish people as a people.
Mm,
So that idea is completely based on the lie that Jews aren't a people and that Jews aren't a people that come from the land of Israel. Any curricula that I've seen, and I know you've seen a bunch of them, you know that I've seen a bunch of them too, completely erased Jewish connection to the land of Israel. And it relies on that. Because actually, if the people were calling for land back and indigenous rights and to decolonize Israel, then they would be the strongest Zionists there.
right. Yeah.
And that's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is a different type of erasure and dehumanization when it comes to Jewish people.
So a lot of the curricula that you see, particularly in the United States in K through 12 education, where it's talking about this, conflict, if you will, is it erasing the the story of Israel? I mean, how is it being presented in a way that is leading to this again, this increasing what I see as an increasing anti-Semitism among, the globalization of the in see, I can't even speak today. Anyways, you got what I said. But even in our K through 12 classroom, and what is that? How is that? What does that look like in a K through 12 curriculum when they're talking about the conflict?
Um, Partially it's like scholarly genocide. There is this deep
Mm,
desire to erase Jewish people, to wipe Israel off the map, to pretend that Jewish people aren't indigenous people, and to replace the Jewish story and insert a different group of people there. And we saw that in multiple ways. I mean, too many to count since October 7th from um, the, I don't know what you call it, what is it called, the when there's the baby Jesus and all of that on Christmas
the
for
manger.
the manger. Okay,
Mhm.
so the manger scene at the Vatican where the figure of baby Jesus was wrapped in a keffiyeh, and there's a picture of the former pope um looking at this scene. And so there's this erasure of even the Jewish peoplehood of Jesus, who is a full-on Christian figure wrapped in this Islamist garb
Mm.
to dehumanize and erase Jewish people and Jewish history in that land.
I had not heard that story, by the way. I'm surprised.
Oh, I'll
That's
send you the picture after this. I mean, it was insane, and people were rightfully outraged. But I mean, Christians and Jews alike, and I hopefully some others were rightfully outraged because I think that was kind of the most bold symbol of
right.
the type of erasure that we've seen in recent months.
So when we talk about American values, um, are there any American values that we can kind of hold up as something that would fight what we're seeing with this oppressor oppressed narrative, the decolonization narrative, the anti-Semitism we're seeing, any racism that we're seeing? What are American values? I mean, are there a common set of American values that we could uphold as something, as a goal, I mean, right now we're seeing, we kind of mentioned this earlier, we're seeing a lot of people holding up socialist values as the answer, Marxist values as the answer. Um, are American values the answer? Is there a value system that we have forgotten about or that we could build that is the answer?
I believe so. Can we build it? Time will tell. I think that one of the things, I stand on the shoulder of giants. I think of all of the people that came before us that fought and, thank God, won the battle for equality to make the words of the Constitution true and apply to all American citizens. Those are our values. equal justice under that, not equitable,
Mm-hmm.
equal,
Equal.
equal access. So when I think of American values, I think of those, our forebears, who again fought and thank God won the battles for those rights to be applied to all of us, weren't fighting for a separate set of equitable rules and some sort of, I at least put me in the right category in the oppression binary.
Mm-hmm.
It was that the founding rights and documents of our nation would be applied as they should equally to all citizens. And I think we've gotten away from that a little bit, sometimes because those rights weren't applied for so long equally to all Americans. I don't think we need to invent something new. I always argue and get in this debate with people. Our Constitution is the most freedom-giving document ever penned.
Mm-hmm.
We just need to follow it and make sure that it's followed, and hold those who aren't following it and are supposed to and responsible to, make sure that they're held accountable.
And I think when I ask that question, it's a bit of a loaded question, right? Because one of the things that I value so much about America is its pluralism, is its diversity. But we've kind of taken those ideas of pluralism and diversity and built up this idea of multiculturalism, which allows these kind of separate, ideas, separate entities to impose their rule or their law above an American value. And I mean, I really have had a hard time struggling with that because again, I for me, I kind of thought, oh, multiculturalism is good, it's diversity, it's pluralism. But the way that it's like been moved is it separates out like a common value, a common core. And I don't know that a country, any country, America or otherwise, but particularly a country as diverse and pluralistic as America can survive without some common core values. And so looking back at the Constitution seems like, an elegant solution. The problem is so many people right now, I feel like you had mentioned at the beginning, is their American flag. Do you say the Pledge of Allegiance? And we have done so much to harm the image of America with some of the narratives that we have, that I don't know that even the symbolism around America is so divisive, the American flag. We were having a conversation the other day about a document that we were creating, and we didn't want to use the word patriot, which in its purest form is, I mean, I think that's a cool word, right? I mean, in its purest form, but that it's become a buzzword for something else. And so that's where I'm struggling with this idea of finding common American values, but I don't know that even using that term, American values,
Right.
is going to bring people to the table.
I agree with you. I'm not sure that it will. That doesn't mean I think that we shouldn't try. So I was listening a couple of months ago to the British MP, excuse me, Kemi Benadoc. I'm maybe mispronouncing her last name. And she was asked a similar question, and her response was that, and this is, she's speaking about the United Kingdom. And she was saying that they can have a multi-ethnic society, but multicultural societies do just what you said. It kind of balkanizes a country.
Right.
And it was an interesting, I'd never considered that or thought of it and from that perspective, but I appreciate what she said. And I think that we should be having more of those conversations. What does it mean to be a pluralistic, multi-ethnic country with one main culture? And that doesn't mean that you don't still have, little things that you do that come from your ancestors, but they don't go against the main culture of the country you're living in.
Yeah. I think that goes back to a really fundamental book, Eric Kaufman's White Shift, where he talks about that. I mean, and I love that the British, was it member said, we have a multi-ethnic society, but multicultural is more difficult. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, if we don't, the constitutional values, I mean, even that is in dispute. So I'm just wondering, and then, you've got all these various, breakpoints, anti-Semitism, racism, et cetera, in there that are add on top of it Marxism, and it's just the perfect storm.
It is. I mean, I think that many people were, I don't want to say so much asleep at the wheel, even though that's a really good example, because who would expect that we would be where we are today even 10 years ago, most people weren't seeing the red flags because there weren't as many, or maybe they existed, but only in certain parts of society that the majority of Americans weren't necessarily part of.
Right. Right. So let's end on a good note. um, we've seen I mean, we've kind of touched on this throughout, but what are the things that you're seeing with regards to racism, DEI, anti-Semitism that you see are moving in a positive direction? That if we continue on that, if we continue to kind of incorporate these themes into our daily life and these trends might actually push us out of this, morass that we're in.
I think that I'm seeing a lot of Americans across different communities really just go back to, excuse me, really just go back to what I think is a pretty common American value, which is a live and let live. People don't want to be stereotyped or put into a box or told that they have to do A, B, and C in order to be worthy of this particular right, or to be worthy to have access to this particular institution. By and large, in my experience, Americans are a live and let live society, and there has been this permission given to reject the binary, to reject being called and labeled a victim, to reject the label of oppressor. People seem to be showing a lot more courage, saying, I'm not doing that. I have no desire, no interest in that. I don't want my kids to be taught that. I want my kids to be taught how to read and how to paint and maybe how to, fix a leaky pipe. But this isn't what I want our tax dollars spent on. And as I see more people rejecting the illiberalism, that gives me confidence that we are going to be moving in the right direction with a lot of bumps in the road.
Yeah, yeah. And do you see that also impacting the anti-Semitism that we've seen if we were to walk that same path? What else? What extra do we need to do at the moment to address the growing anti-Semitism that we've seen?
I think hold leaders accountable and responsible. And there's that, the old phrase or old saying that with what is it, with great responsibility?
Yeah, yeah.
What is the
Yes, yeah. With great power is great responsibility.
right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we've given great power over to maybe to some folks that don't deserve it. And this is, my little, maybe it's a little bit of a dig. I didn't go to an Ivy League institution, so I'm not putting them on a pedestal because I'm seeing what's coming out of them. And it's not Ivy League scholarship. So maybe we need to, have power where people are going to be responsibly wielding it instead of looking towards folks that may be self-labeled as experts and maybe don't really have expertise.
Okay. Are there any? I said we were going to leave on a positive note.
Yeah.
Are there? I was just looking at your son. I have not finished yet. Your son's piece in the White Rose magazine. What are your concerns right now? Are there any concerns that we've seen? Kind of, and you and I talked about this earlier. The red, and they call it a red-green coalition, right?
Alliance,
With
yeah.
the liberalism and the like kind of pro-Arab, like
It's with like Marxism and Islamists.
Marxism and Islamists, right? Do you see any concern with some of the right, kind of extremism with regards to anti-Semitism?
Yes, and I want to say, even though we talk about it and kind of frame it this way, and I think in Dimitri, my oldest kid's article, they're called the woke right. What we're really illiberalism can impact all sides of the political spectrum. And on the far right, I think what we're seeing is a level of isolationism that concerns me as a proud American. I don't understand the desire to shy away from being a leader, being a light into the nations, and being a superpower. That exists a bit on the extreme right, to where there's a desire to kind of no. Their view of of America first is America alone, and I don't think that that's even possible in the 21st century, let alone desirable, especially when we know that we have adversaries out there that are looking to replace us and be their version of a light into the nations. And I do not believe any freedom-loving American would want to live under their rule. So yeah, we are seeing it. Some of the same illiberal tendencies fuel it, whether it's racism or anti-Semitism or any other type of bigotry, because a lot of times those types of prejudices fuel illiberalism. I mean, that's what we're seeing.
Right, right? On both sides. It's been an interesting swing of the pendulum. And yet we still see the anti-racism, on the rise. And that's really concerning to me because we've noted this before. I mean, I really feel that Jews in so many ways are the canary in the coal mine. It's simple to anti-Semitism is for a lot of people, it's unrecognizable, but it's once you recognize it, it's so recognizable of a much larger and bigger problem in
Right.
our society. So, all right, Brandy, thank you so much for taking the time to update us on your counterweight presentation
Thanks, Jen.
and the recent events in growing anti-Semitism. We appreciate you.
Thank you for listening. Please consider donating to the Institute for Liberal Values, a 501c3 nonprofit organization at ilvalues.org. All donations go to support our continued programming to realize our mission to provide the skills and support required to build community where there has been division, to encourage free expression where there has been censorship, and to foster optimism where there is fear.